Well, Dr. Meryl Nass, thank you very much for coming down to visit us today and to talk with us. I know we've had a version of this conversation before, but we've got this nice new studio now, so I wanted to talk with you again because I think your story is one that needs to be known by a broader audience, and maybe outside of Maine and outside of some smaller circles isn't as well known as it should be. So to start with, I'd just like to hear a little bit about your background. I know you've been practicing medicine for 40 years. You've given testimony in Congress about Gulf War syndrome, about the anthrax vaccine, a renowned medical expert, and now you don't have a license to practice medicine.
Yes.
So it's kind of an odd journey that you've taken from being a medical expert who is so well versed in vaccines and healthcare, the human body, medical treatments, that Congress is asking you down to share your insight and your wisdom with them, to now being at a point where the governor of Maine, her sister, and the Bureau of Licensure and Medicine have decided that you spread misinformation on the radio and should no longer have a license to practice medicine. So there's a lot that happened between the beginning and the end there. So just start at the beginning and tell us, how you got involved in medicine and some of your experiences as a congressional expert witness.
Well, I got a medical license at the age of 29 and was board certified as an internal medicine doctor, did a residency. I had gone to MIT. I had won a National Merit Scholarship. I was one of those smart, annoying kids in school. And I always wanted to do something good for society. And originally I thought I might be a physicist, but because the physicist had led to creating the atom bomb and then the hydrogen bomb, I decided, no, that wasn't for me. I wanted to go into something safe where my science wouldn't be abused by a military. And so I went into medicine, and I'd also traveled widely around the world in between college and med school. I'd hitchhiked around Africa and India and Europe. And so I had a sense of what goes on in the world, maybe more broad than most Americans. And I had considered even working in Africa. But of course, I got married in medical school, had a kid right the month I graduated, and so I wasn't going to go to Africa anytime soon. I began practicing. I joined Physicians for Social Responsibility, and in my late 30s, went to a meeting, and I was told that researchers at UMass, I was practicing in Amherst, Mass, had contracts with the Army's biodefense facility at Fort Detrick to develop a better anthrax vaccine, and that this might be germ warfare, and the organization Physicians for Social Responsibility, in conjunction with students from UMass, wanted to protest this. And
So around what time was this?
so this was 1988 or 89.
Okay.
And I was asked to read the contract, read the professor's CV, and report back to the group. So I did. And I found out that actually the contract, even though it was titled Studies to Produce a Better Anthrax Vaccine, actually had nothing to do with vaccines. It was all about doing primitive genetic engineering on anthrax. So it's a bacterium that has plasmids in it. It is a little round, extra genetic material that sit in the cytoplasm of these bacteria. So it's anthrax.
Let's get a little bit more basic, because all I know about anthrax is that it's a powder that arrives in a white envelope, and then Dick Cheney tells us we have to invade Iraq or something.
Yeah.
Right. Let's get,
Okay.
Very basically, what is anthrax?
So many anthrax are bacteria. Singular is bacterium. And just like streptococcus, it's a bacterium. And there are multiple strains. So it's called Bacillus anthracis is the technical Latin name. And in the Bacillus genus are many different species, and anthrax is one of them. And so this particular researcher was moving the plasmids around, moving genetic material around between various Bacillus species to create new ones. And Why was he doing that? It's not clear. That wasn't explained in the contract, but it was a form.
It sounds disturbingly similar to gain-of-function research.
Exactly. That's what it was. And using old-fashioned techniques, not modern techniques. Of course, this was back in the 80s, and this particular researcher was about 70 years old. And it turned out that he and 3 of his colleagues at UMass had formerly worked at Fort Detrick. And when Fort Detrick's offensive program was shut down, he'd been in the offensive program, they moved to UMass and basically continued the research outside.
Did these people emigrate from Germany in the 1940s or 1950s by any chance?
Not these people, but some others.
Right.
Anyway, the students protested. UMass was shut down for a while in 1989, and I became a national spokesperson for Physicians for Social Responsibility on anthrax and biological warfare. I became very interested in the subject. Why is this professor doing this research? What is the Army trying to do? And I worked with a Quaker group at that time, Friends Committee on National Legislation, who hired a fellow named John, what's his name? John. He ran for Attorney General in Massachusetts. Jonathan, his father's from Ecuador. Nice guy. Anyway, when he had graduated from Brown University, he was hired to help get information on this program. Again, I'm talking 1989. And Francis Crowe, who was a famous Quaker activist in Northampton, Mass., worked with me. And together we gathered, I sent out FOIA requests. We gathered all this information, and I spent the next 3 years reading everything there was to read on anthrax, and became quite knowledgeable, because in those days you could read everything. I went to the Countway Library in Harvard and was reading journals from the 1830s that were crumbling in my hands, reading cases of anthrax that were described back then. So anyway, I knew a lot about it. I didn't think it was going to go anywhere, but suddenly we're approaching the Gulf War, and it was about anthrax. And I was about the only civilian in the country who knew a whole lot about anthrax. I wrote several papers. I wrote one about why was the Army had published a paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association explaining that biodefense and biooffense initially look the same when you do the research, but they diverge, and you can identify the divergence, and they were only staying on the good side. So they published a paper explaining exactly what they did. But I had unearthed the fact that they actually weren't staying on the good side, that they were doing things that they in their own paper said were proscribed, not allowed. So
they were lying.
They were lying. And so I wrote a paper and published in 1991 about that. And I published another paper about how one would investigate a potential biowarfare event to tell whether it was really natural or whether it was caused by offensive biological warfare, because they're hard to distinguish. And then
I guess in layman's terms, can you describe how you would tell the difference between an offensive versus a defensive event?
Yeah, well, let me give you an example. So then the next year, I published a paper which turned out to be a very important paper, because I was the first person in the world to do this, is I took an epidemic, which was the world's largest anthrax epidemic that we know about, which occurred in Rhodesia during its civil war. I analyzed it from every perspective and showed that it was due to biological warfare. So how did I do that? I looked at so anthrax is unique in that it's caused by spores, and when you lay them down in the ground, they stay there. And the spores can last for 100 years, but possibly. They can also regrow in the soil if the right conditions, so they can germinate and then resporulate, become spores again. And so I showed that in many of the areas where anthrax occurred in Rhodesia, there had been no prior cases. So there was none in the soil to resporulate, so someone had to put them there. There were about 5 possible theories that people had raised about why did they suddenly have this massive anthrax epidemic, 10,000 human cases. thousands and thousands of cases in cattle, killing cattle. All of the cattle belonged to black people, even though the country was mostly black, but the land mass was owned half by whites and half by blacks. But it was only the black areas that were affected. Anyway, I showed that it wasn't due to insects. I showed it wasn't due to veterinary treatments and the fact that the carcasses weren't being buried deeply. There were a number of
all
reasons
kinds of
why.
vectors
All sorts of things. There were claims that people were carrying meat from one place to another, and that was spreading it. And I explained why that hadn't happened. And I was able to. I went to Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, and was able to go through their files. And because at the time they'd been a British colony, they actually kept really good records of where anthrax cases had been for the previous 40 years and where they were now. And so I was able to do this detailed analysis. And I showed there'd only been about 10 or 20 cases a year, and all of a sudden they were having 8,000 cases in a year. How does that happen? So I published this paper, and nobody's ever challenged it. It's pretty comprehensive, but I don't think the military or the intelligence agencies liked it because it was the first time I'd laid out that you could use these scientific methods and epidemiology. Where did cases occur before? How did cases spread? And rule out some of the theories about why it happened. Like, for instance, I had to look at when a mosquito bites you, how much blood is transferred, right? You can get malaria if a mosquito bites you that's previously bitten a person with malaria. So, well, how many spores would it take? And I could show that there wasn't enough blood being transferred to give you anthrax because it took too many spores. That kind of analysis.
So theoretically, if you were in the military and you were looking to develop an anthrax-based bioweapon,
yes.
and you thought, well, since this is natural somewhat, we could use this
we
and
can get
no
away
one
with
would
it.
ever know.
Exactly.
And so you came along and studied it in Rhodesia and found a case where I'm assuming that perhaps some white powerful interests were using it to target black landowners.
Yes, because they were in a civil war.
You exposed that an offensive use of anthrax could be determined.
So I believe that my paper made it much harder for anyone to use anthrax as a weapon in the future.
Which I would say is a good thing. It's a great contribution to society. As someone who doesn't want to catch anthrax, I think, thank you.
Yeah, so, that's why I chose to spend most of my spare time for 3 years working on that. And, most people, who's an expert on anthrax? So most people never heard of the paper. It just went by, and I lived my life. But then, again, after the Gulf War, we wound up in 1997 with Secretary of Defense Cohen, a Mainer, telling the world that they're going to vaccinate the whole world, the world of military service members, which was 2.5 million people, against anthrax, because they were worried that the Iraqis still had it. And even though they had not found any weapons of mass destruction in anthrax, well, it turned out in congressional testimony, and I've examined the documents, it's true that the United States had actually given Iraq a strain of anthrax called Volum that we had used. So we were making anthrax weapons during World War II to potentially be used against Germany by the Brits and maybe by the Americans in a factory outside Terre Haute, Indiana, cattle cakes. And the strain of anthrax we were using was Volum. So we knew that it was a fairly virulent strain. It was intended to kill. And that strain we had given to Iraq prior to the Gulf War.
So why? I guess what was the military's rationale for giving?
Well, I don't think they ever presented a rationale. It wasn't the military that gave it. So we have an entity, a sort of public-private entity called, it's in Manassas, Virginia. It may have moved. What's it called? The American Type Culture Collection. So, but it has to work with the Commerce Department so it has to get permission from the Commerce Department to transfer microorganisms, and it collects massive numbers of microorganisms and then sells them. So it was through this entity that Iraq was able to order this, but the Commerce Department approved the sales. So we assume that, but that gave us
Somebody
plausible
approved it,
deniability
yeah.
as well. Oh, we were just stupid. We made a mistake.
So we gave Iraq a virulent version of anthrax, and then
Yes. Not our best anthrax. We have a better, more virulent
well,
version.
that's great.
Right.
At least we're selling them our cut rate anthrax, our Walmart anthrax, I guess. But then, having given them this anthrax, it's then used as a pretext by President Clinton and Secretary of Defense Bill Cohen to inject 2.5 million servicemen and women with a
Yes.
vaccine and
Right.
immunization.
And-
I know
and
those
to
are loaded, like so many words in our culture today.
Yes.
Vaccine and immunization
Right.
have kind of
Right.
lost meaning and
Well,
been
let's just say
obscured.
vaccinate.
That shot, injection, something.
Right. Not only as the reason to vaccinate them, but because they didn't want blowback that somebody would find out we had given it to them and now our soldiers are dying of anthrax. So it immunized the commanders and the president, but also was an excuse to make war on Iraq twice, and excursions. At other times. I mean, we're still making excursions into
War's
Iraq.
business.
Yeah.
There are always people making money off of war. I don't think it's even a controversial thing these days to say
Yes.
that the excursions into Iraq and Afghanistan were profitable endeavors, except for the
We're
people who
intended
paid.
to be profitable.
We're intended to be, but we're profitable except for the people who died there and the people who paid for the wars. So I don't think there are very few people who would disagree with that nowadays, especially the men and women that I've talked with who have served in Iraq
Yes.
and Afghanistan, who have
Yes.
kind of wondered what their rah-rah patriotism, go America, fighting for freedom attitude at the time was justified. I think there's a lot of, dispiritedness or disillusionment with Iraq, and knowing that we've sold them anthrax,
Right. And
sold them
our
anthrax
whole
and
foreign
then
policy.
invaded. Yeah, our entire
But
foreign
especially,
policy. Yeah.
the people in the military know that our foreign policy rests on the fact that the United States is the international police force, and that can be used offensively or defensively, and they feel that Smedley Butler said it how many years ago? Almost 100 years ago. General Smedley Butler, war is a racket. Mm-hmm. And if you repeated that for 80 years, you were a conspiracy theorist. But now I think, it's been proven true. I even didn't want to believe that. But, with what I've seen in these last 25 years, I do believe it, unfortunately. When I started fighting against the program to vaccinate 2.5 million people with anthrax vaccine, because I knew it was causing a lot of injuries. There were many problems with it. It had been expired. It wasn't even legally being used. It had been redated. It hadn't passed. The documents had been transferred to FDA to show that the vaccine had passed the tests that are required. Failed to show many failures in the testing.
So who was developing the anthrax vaccine? And I guess why did it get to the point where there was congressional testimony about it, as opposed to the military just saying, line up, soldier, and get your shots?
Well, the military did say that. So it's a very complicated story. So the military, since at least 1950, was working on anthrax vaccines. And so military scientists, and there were at least 10 different iterations, 10 different versions of anthrax vaccines that were developed because they all had problems. Between 1950 and the 1970s. And almost all of the vaccine that was produced was being used on animal experiments, and used by the scientists who were working on anthrax to vaccinate themselves. In 1970, though, the Army had applied for a license. Now, this is before vaccines were regulated by FDA. That happened in 72. But because of until 1972, there was a little branch of NIH called the Center for Biologics or something like that. Um, Harry Meyer was the chief. He felt that the vaccine industry was a young industry that needed to be coddled and needed to be supported, and that failures by that industry could be ignored. And so his group, approved polio vaccines that had been shown to cause paralysis in monkeys. And so the regulators weren't regulating very well. And so Congress decided all the vaccines should be moved into FDA, which was only regulating drugs at that time. Vaccines are now considered within the realm of drugs. So a vaccine is also a drug, and it's a vaccine. Anyway, that happened in 1972, but 2 years before that transfer happened, this group at NIH licensed the anthrax vaccine, the current anthrax vaccine, without efficacy data, without proper efficacy data, and without proper safety data. So do you know how they looked at safety? They vaccinated people. They went back 1 day later and 2 days later and looked at the arm, said, "How do you feel?" And they stopped. 2 days of analysis.
So if your arm doesn't fall off after 2 days,
Yes.
it's considered safe, yeah.
And so that is not what the FDA now requires for safety. You need to look at least a month. But anyway, there have been a number of vaccines that were licensed with only 2 days, 3 days, 5 days of analysis for safety. And way back in the 50s and 60s, for some reason it was thought that if you inject a drug, you could only get localized symptoms. You weren't going to cause something systemic, whereas everybody knew if you swallowed a pill, it could cause systemic whole body side effects. Why wouldn't injecting you, which is bypassing all the body's safety measures, why wouldn't that do the same thing? I don't know why, but there was a belief out there, or maybe it was a conspiracy theory. I mean, I don't. But for some reason, the vaccine regulators felt like they could get away with basically ignoring safety. And so, who was making the anthrax vaccine? Well, it was all made under license with the Army. It was made first by Merck, and then it was transferred to the Michigan Department of Public Health, who was making anthrax vaccine for the military for decades. And then the Michigan Department of Public Health kind of spun their vaccine factory. They had a whole compound with many buildings making lots of vaccines, like 20 or 10 different vaccines, and other biologic products like albumin or serum. But it was old and decrepit, and the state didn't want to spend the money to fix it. So they spun it off and called it the Michigan Biologic Products Institute and kept it going for a few years. And then basically, when the Army decided they wanted to give everybody anthrax vaccine, they needed this factory to work. FDA, because as I said, they were only giving, the 99% of the vaccine was going into animals, not humans. And Army said to FDA, look, you're not vaccinated. It might not be safe for you to inspect the factory. We'll do we'll inspect it, we'll take care of it. So FDA had not been in this plant for at least 10 years, maybe 20 years. And in 1997, FDA finally said, look, if you're going to vaccinate 2.5 million people, we better go inspect. They went in there in November of 1997, after Secretary Cohen had said, we're vaccinating everybody. And that day, FDA shut the plant down. They said, this place is a mess. We can't. And they looked at the stockpile. There were 11 million doses stockpiled, and they looked at the vials, and they said, wow, we can see bacterial growth, we can see fungal growth, we can see black stopper material mixed in. Turned out they had not known that this Michigan Biologic Products Institute had just been taking these vials, and instead of throwing them away, they had a 2 or 3 year expiration date. Instead of throwing them away, they would just retest them and retest them and retest them and redate them without making new vaccine.
So they were just doing basic
Fraud.
poor safety practices. Well, fraud, but also poor safety practices.
Yes,
just like
and
stuff,
not
stuff you
telling-
learn in high
yes.
school science classes is
Exactly.
not going to work out well.
They had also changed their production process, so the filters had gone from ceramic filters to sort of plastic thin filters. So the production process had changed, which requires an FDA approval. They had never applied to FDA to approve that. You know, this is the Army. They just do what they want. You know, the Army creates Superfund sites.
Yeah, move fast and break things.
Yes.
To hell with the consequences. So
Right.
They've
Right.
discovered that this, you know, they've gone in, they've first of all given Iraq anthrax, and they've effectively nationalized a decrepit old vaccine manufacturing plant in Michigan, and the FDA discovers that it's wildly unhealthy, unsanitary, and then this is what brings it to the forefront of national attention.
Right. No, not that yet. So I FOIA'd for the FDA report, and I was on a group email of people who are interested in biodefense, and this was right at the end of 1997. And I asked people, I said, do you want me to send you copies? This place is really a mess. And so people from the Canadian government who worked on biodefense, and even in the U.S. government and academics, about 10 people said, yes, send me the report. So I spread it out, and then it became more widely known how bad this factory was. And FDA, so they had 11 million doses of the vaccine in vials, and FDA quarantined 9 million. So there's no way you can use these 9. But these 2 million, we're not seeing anything in the vials. They have been expired and redated, but we'll let you have them. Because remember, the Army had already said, we're starting the program. On March 15th of 1998, they started injecting people with this stuff. And people immediately started getting sick. Because I was on this... trying to think how. Anyway, I wound up being asked to write a correspondence for the Lancet on the anthrax vaccine, which I did in early '98, and that went viral because I was able to.
Although I know it's not a virus. So.
Right, yeah. and I'd written a short piece for this mailing list that I was on, and I could, because I was so knowledgeable about anthrax, I could cite to the fact that Congress had already had a hearing in 95 or 96 where it was discussed that the anthrax vaccine used several years earlier in the Gulf War may have been a cause of Gulf War syndrome. And people didn't know that had taken place. And there was good evidence that anthrax vaccine was probably one of the causes of Gulf War syndrome.
And what were the symptoms of Gulf War syndrome, and about how many people did it affect?
The government said it affected 150,000 of the 700,000 that were sent to the Gulf. We don't know if those numbers are correct. I
would just assume they're a lie,
actually,
based on what we know.
Maybe more than that, 150 to 250,000. The Army said 150,000 people received an anthrax vaccine. That number may not be correct either because the Army classified your anthrax vaccination. And you may remember people who went to the Gulf often said they had to sign an informed consent that they weren't allowed to read, and they weren't told what vaccines they were getting.
Yeah.
There was vaccine A or vaccine B.
Yeah, I know people who have
or,
gone through the process.
Yes.
They stand in line and they just walk through, and it's shot.
Exactly. But specifically for the Gulf War, the military said, well, we don't want the other side to know we don't have enough anthrax vaccine for everybody. We don't want the military to know which troops were and which troops weren't, because they might use anthrax on the ones that weren't vaccinated, so we're not going to tell anybody. It
almost sounds like an AB control group that the military had established.
Well, B was, anyway, they had lots of pseudonyms for and they also used unapproved products. There were many, when you're in a war or Operation
an overseas
Sword and
contingency
Shield.
operation.
It gives the military an opportunity to try out things that they're developing. So there were lots of different things that different soldiers got in different units. But a lot of them got anthrax vaccine. A lot of them got sick. Then there was a case in Canada at that time. So the United States had urged Canada, the UK, and Australia, as well as us, to start vaccinating their troops for anthrax as well. So programs started in all those countries, and there were protests in all those countries. It turned out in the UK there was actually law that you couldn't force people, so a lot of people did not take. Britain had their own anthrax vaccine. In Canada there were protests as well. There was a lawsuit, so an airman in Canada refused to take it. He was court-martialed. The case went to the highest military judge, and I was his expert witness. Arthur Friedlander from Fort Detrick was the expert witness. So Americans came to Canada, to Manitoba, Winnipeg, for the trial, and as a result of my testimony, and I'd brought a suitcase of documents with me, which I found out you don't do that in court cases, because I just put the suitcase next to me, and the judge would ask me a question, I'd pull out a document here, and it's like, no, you just tell us.
You're over-prepared. That's a good thing.
Well, it's like, well, that's just not how courts work. Once you're qualified as an expert, they're supposed to take your word, and you're not supposed to be pulling out documents unless those documents have been qualified and you've made them exhibits in the case. But these were pretrial hearings, so they didn't have that kind of protocol. Anyway, the airman got off, and the reason he got off was because he said, look, in the Gulf War I took the anthrax vaccine, it made me very sick. And so now in 1998, I don't want to take it because I know what it did to me then. And so that stopped all anthrax vaccinations in Canada for a while. But then the Canadian military appealed, and nobody wanted to put more money into a case, and so they wound up getting their appeal sort of uncontested.
Mm-hmm. It's hard to fight the government when they have unlimited money.
Exactly. The price of admission to the courts is very high.
And so then I remember it was shortly after this time there were anthrax scares in the United States that kind of reignited the national conversation, and cable television has now moved on from the Monica Lewinsky thing and needs a new thing to run with all the time. And so that kind of was, pre 9/11, that was the big, terrorism scare.
Yes.
And so I think it was around this time when you were testifying in front of Congress about it, correctly?
Yeah. So the testimonies I made started in April of 1999 when I published a review article on anthrax vaccines, which was the first to actually analyze all the literature. I had about 100 footnotes to everything that had ever been published about anthrax vaccine, and discussed why it had never been shown to be safe or to work. And that year there were 5 hearings of the Government Reform Committee. Started out in the National Security Subcommittee, which was run by Congressman Shea from Connecticut, and then Chris Shea, and then Dan Burton, who was the head of the full committee, took it over and continued. So there were 5 hearings that went into every aspect of anthrax vaccine, like how was it made, was it necessary, who has anthrax in the world, and the General Accounting Office had a team researching all this to provide, because they are the investigatory arm of Congress. And then their other congressional committees had hearings also on other aspects. So there was hearing in like the Military Personnel Subcommittee, and the House and Senate VA committees also had hearings where I testified at both of those. So there was a lot going on starting in 1999, and soldiers were refusing the vaccine because they were seeing how sick it was making their colleagues. It was a very dangerous vaccine, lots of side effects. And so a group that I worked with filed suit to get the license revoked. The military then discharged all of our plaintiffs immediately, and so the suit was moot as a result. And then our lawyers had to figure out how to file another suit. We got Jane and John Doe plaintiffs, so that it couldn't happen again. The judge let us proceed, and late in 2004, so we had gotten a judgment, what do you call it, a TRO, I think, in 2003, and that's when the military discharged all the plaintiffs. And then in 2004, we got a judgment from Judge Emmett Sullivan, D.C. District, saying, look, soldiers risk their lives as they enter the military. They can't also be asked to be guinea pigs for medical experimentation. This vaccine was never licensed properly. He said, this is the worst set of paperwork I've ever seen. I'm revoking the license. And he said FDA had never issued a comment period. There was never an efficacy trial, fix this. And so suddenly there was no license. The Army decided they were going to keep vaccinating anyway without a license. That's an experiment. We went back to court, and Judge Sullivan said, you can't do that. You can't force these people to take an unlicensed product. You're enrolling everybody in an experiment without informed consent. I want my notice posted in every vaccine clinic in the military. And so then guess what happened? The PrEP Act was passed by Congress, which enabled the military to give unlicensed vaccines to soldiers. But
so they were going to get their way, one way or the other.
Like you said, don't fight the military,
Yeah.
don't fight the government.
Was it just the military behind it, though? Or, I mean, I assume that there was also some money to be made somewhere if they were willing to, fight the temporary restraining order, discharge these soldiers, and then go through Congress. I mean, getting a bill passed through Congress specifically to allow this kind of a...
But of course, Congress didn't know. They thought they were just... They went through fast. They were told this was after 9/11.
It was for national security.
National security.
Yeah, okay.
But the Army still felt they had to give informed consent. They couldn't force soldiers to take it. So our revocation still was good for military service members for about a year and a half, at which point, which was around 2006, the FDA had issued a comment period. I commented. I gave them a very long comment listing about 40 reasons why they couldn't license the vaccine, given what we know about it. And I had, again, a huge number of footnotes. And they licensed the vaccine anyway. And then they told me they were able to throw out my comment because I hadn't given them hard copies of every footnote. They had an arcane rule in the FDA that they could ignore comments if they didn't come with hard copies of footnotes. Who knew that?
I thought the purpose of footnotes was so that you didn't have to provide the hard copies.
Right, exactly, exactly. And you tell them where to find it. So that was how they managed to relicense the vaccine, and they also bulldozed the entire factory in early 1999. Got rid of all the evidence, and rebuilt it at taxpayer expense. But it was purchased also in 1998, September 98, by a private company that was affiliated with Admiral Crowe, who had been head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So he told some friends of his, look, this anthrax vaccine is up for sale. We can get it at bargain basement price. Let's go in it together. And he didn't have to put any money in. He got his friend El Hibri, who was a shady character, and his son, Ibrahim El Hibri, and Fuad El Hibri, the son, to put in the money, with a small amount of money coming from officials at the plant. And they went in and bought it from the state of Michigan in 1998. But they waited until the Secretary of the Army had signed a form saying they would be liable for any problems. So the taxpayer became the insurance company for this dreadful place, rebuilt the factory for these people who had bought it for turned out about 18 or 19 million. They bought the whole facility, like many buildings. There were licenses for many vaccines and other products, but they decided to surrender most of those licenses rather than have to rebuild those facilities too. And they relied on having the Army as their sole customer, and they were the only source of anthrax vaccine in the United States.
So
they had a monopoly.
Got close connections to the military, mysterious, shady financing,
Right.
A monopoly on a product, and a forced customer.
And
Lots of political
and Admiral
connections.
Crowe, who became CROWE, became the chairman of the board, and got his cronies to go along with this. And then they made 300% profits selling the vaccine to the Army, even though they could not pass an inspection for a number of years. But eventually they did. And so now we're still giving some troops anthrax vaccine. It's cleaner than it was. It's no longer expired. They did get approvals for the changes that they made eventually. But we have the PrEP Act now, which we're dealing with. The PrEP Act is how the COVID vaccine was rolled out to the population without having to prove safety or efficacy.
Because
the PrEP Act says in an emergency you don't have to, as long as the Secretary of Health and Human Services and the Commissioner of the FDA think it's more likely than not that this vaccine is going to help you, there's more good than harm, we can roll out an experimental vaccine or drug.
So I guess with all of that as backdrop, that's the kind of life experience and educational and medical experience that you brought to December of 2019 when the world starts to go through this COVID experience. And I do want to get there, but I have to ask, what was Dr. Anthony Fauci doing during this time of the anthrax vaccine? Were you aware of him during this time? Did you interact with him at all? Because he's obviously going to be, he's a central figure in the COVID drama as it plays out.
I never interacted with him. I was gratified at the time. He went on TV and people asked him, will you support anthrax vaccine for civilians? And he said, the anthrax vaccine has a lot of baggage, so he would not. So that was good. He did something good. I wasn't aware at the time that what he was doing with HIV was very shady, that he was suppressing good treatments and pushing for AZT, a dangerous treatment. I had no idea. I learned that later when COVID happened.
So you thought it was nice what he was saying about anthrax,
yeah.
but it turned out he only had bandwidth for just one evil medical experiment at any given moment.
Well, he wouldn't have made any money on the anthrax.
Yes.
The money was tied up with the Army so the company that bought it was called Bioport, and then because there was so much bad press about how bad the vaccine was, they changed their name to Emergent Biosolutions, and then later they became so wealthy they bought the Narcan, they bought the smallpox vaccine from Sanofi. They bought typhoid and cholera vaccines as well. So they're a company that came out of nowhere, totally dependent on massive subsidies from the Army, the taxpayer, and were able to buy all these other products.
Including Narcan.
Including Narcan, which as soon as they bought
it... For those who don't know, the opioid reversal drug.
Yes, the opioid overdose antidote. And as soon as they bought it, the sales rose several 100% because it became required or recommended for schools, hospitals, of course emergency rooms already had it, homeless shelters, like everybody was supposed to have it. And we did have an epidemic of overdoses. So this wasn't a bad thing, but it was interesting that this shady company got in on this deal right before sales exploded because all these entities were required to buy it.
And the opioid epidemic really started accelerating.
At that time,
it's coincidental timing, for sure. We can get back to that, but take me back to December 2019. I assume you were one of the earliest people to begin learning about cases of COVID-19, in Wuhan, China, and you were early to start learning and kind of trying to figure out what exactly was going on. So when did you start to suspect or realize that these scattered news reports were going to become this big, world-changing event, that it was going to be more than just, say,
Right,
a
little
Ebola
outbreak.
or MERS
Because
or
right,
something?
exactly, because these outbreaks happen all the time. And at first, when people asked me about it, I thought it was just going to be another nothing burger. In February, there was already some talk of dealings in Congress. Congress was getting briefings about it, and some members of Congress, I think including Richard Burr, who is sort of the biodefense maven in Congress, were selling stock.
Yeah, and buying Zoom.
And they later got investigated, several members of Congress, for insider trading.
Yeah, investigated but never punished.
Right.
Yeah.
And Congress made a rule that they were allowed to do insider trading around that time. So I realized something was up, that enough people were getting really worried, and I started paying attention. Okay, what's the treatment? How do we deal with this? And found that the Chinese had sent a group from this, I don't know how to pronounce Chinese words, Zhenjiang, Zhenjiang, I think.
You're talking about the Western province?
This was a famous medical school, kind of like Harvard Medical School, They had sent people from that medical school and hospital to Wuhan to try to gain control. These were some of their top people, and these people, the Chinese, had immediately written a brochure, like a 60-page brochure about this is what we did, this is the PPE we used, these are the techniques, this is how we controlled the air, these are the drugs we tried, these were the ones we thought were the best. And by, I think, late February, they were telling us this. They were publishing, they made an English version. They were meeting with Johns Hopkins scientists and trying to spread the word. And they had numerous clinical trials started, trying all these drugs against SARS, what became SARS-2. China had suffered with SARS-1, which was just called SARS, in 2002 and 2003, which had a 10% mortality rate. They had dealt with it. They had studied it afterwards. The United States didn't really have to deal with it. There had been cases in Canada. Canada knew something about it. It killed nurses and doctors in Canada, killed a lot of them in China. So China already had experience and were smartly using drugs that they knew might work. And they told us about hydroxychloroquine, that was their best drug against it at the time.
So China in February
or early March already knew that. And so
they were saying this publicly, they were publishing it in English language.
Trying to tell people this is the way to go. And they were in the middle of all these at least 20 clinical trials. I think they might have had 20 clinical trials of hydroxychloroquine.
And hydroxychloroquine, to my understanding, is a drug that's been around for a long time. It's anti-malarial.
Yes, it's based on quinine. Quinine comes from the bark of the cinchona tree. It's been used for malaria.
It's like what flavors tonic water, right?
Yes, yeah. Exactly. It's in tonic water, quinine, and that works for malaria. In fact, the Brits who were sent to India used to drink, gin and tonic to prevent malaria.
With lime to prevent scurvy as well. It was an all-in-one health tonic.
Exactly. And hydroxychloroquine has been licensed for like 65 or 70, or chloroquine maybe was first, and then hydroxychloroquine had a little fewer side effects. And also in March, so at the same time, the WHO was gearing up for clinical trials that they were starting in March of 2020. And they didn't want to use hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine. They had other drugs they wanted to try. And many nations were telling them, and by the way, Jeremy Farrar was in charge. He was at the top of the heap of organizing and approving the clinical trials through the WHO at the time. He was the head of the Wellcome Trust at the time. He's currently the head scientific officer of the WHO. But he's basically an agent for the deep state the globalists, and they didn't want to use. They already knew that they didn't want to use hydroxychloroquine. In fact, in France, starting in October of 2019, France had started making efforts to take hydroxychloroquine off the over-the-counter list. It had been you could just walk in and buy it. And many countries you could do that, but not the United States. Many countries in South America, you just walk into a pharmacy and buy it. It had so few side effects. Malaria and other things. It's used for rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, some other autoimmune diseases. I had used it for Lyme disease in conjunction with other drugs. So there are tests on it for cancers. It had multiple effects, and it wasn't a popular drug, but it was a pretty safe drug. Anyway, as long as you use it correctly. The CDC says on their website it's very safe. Pregnant women can use it. You can use it in babies. There's very few drugs you can use in pregnant women, but hydroxychloroquine is one. So anyway, WHO did not want to test it. Other nations prevailed upon the WHO to test it. So then they created a testing protocol that overdosed patients, only gave it to them in the hospital when it was too late, because it generally took about 14 days from the time you got COVID to the time you got sick enough to need hospitalization. And by then the virus was gone and you were dealing with autoimmune phenomena in the body.
So they rigged a study.
So they
on
rigged the study. And then the UK created their own huge study trying to use all the hospitals in the UK, and they used the identical protocol in the UK. Jeremy Farrar was involved with both of these trials. They were the biggest trials of hydroxychloroquine and for COVID in general, because they tried some other drugs too. So both of them were rigged. And then there was a trial in Brazil that was used chloroquine that was also rigged to overdose people. And that trial, in the arm that overdosed people, had, I think, a 39% death rate, which is pretty high, higher than. So if you got nothing and you were in the hospital with COVID, the highest death rates were 25%. Usually they were 10%, depending. If you were put on a ventilator in New York City, the initial death rates were 88%.
Yeah.
So there was a concerted effort to kill the use of hydroxychloroquine.
And Trump, I think, around this time comes out and
Trump
just says the word hydroxychloroquine, which was
around
enough
March 19.
I was to convince the media to join in on the anti-hydroxychloroquine bandwagon.
Well, I don't. So Trump said maybe this is a gift from God around March 19th. And he had spoken to Dr. Zelenko, and he was maybe made aware of the Chinese. And who knows what he was told. He did use it when he eventually was treated for COVID. I had heard about it before then. I was telling people, well, look, the Chinese are using it. This is something we should use. Around this time, my own son, who's a doctor, and he was at the time working at New York Presbyterian, where they brought the first New York COVID cases to that hospital. He wound up catching COVID from one of his colleagues, and he got very sick. And I said, you have to use hydroxychloroquine. He's like, I don't know, will it be okay? Because he was already, somehow he was hearing this chatter that it wasn't okay, which is odd, because even the WHO said, well, if you're on hydroxychloroquine, stay on it. It's okay for all these other conditions, but it's dangerous for COVID. It's like, that doesn't make sense. But people didn't, everyone was so scared about COVID. So I insisted to my son, I said, look, either you can prescribe it for yourself, your wife can prescribe it for you, or I'm driving down to New York and giving you some, because I bought a whole bunch thinking I could give it to patients if there were any trouble. It was very cheap. I bought, 100 pills, 200 pills. I bought a bunch. At that point, at first I didn't buy. When I first heard about it around the end of February, I thought I should leave it for everybody else. But then, as there was more chatter about problems with it, I thought, it might be hard to get, so I better get a bunch so I can give it to patients. And, I must have had enough for 20 or I don't know how many people.
And it was around this time that, so your practice you had catered to people with rheumatoid arthritis, Lyme disease, fibromyalgia, that kind of thing.
Yes.
But because of
I had
all-consuming,
used so much of it in the past, I wasn't afraid of it. You know, I probably had 100 or 200 patients that had already taken it, so I knew that the side effects were fairly minimal. I think you can have psychiatric symptoms. One patient had become getting suicidal thoughts on it, so that could happen. You can have a low blood sugar from it. If you overdose, you can have a cardiac arrhythmia. You know, there were some drug interactions that you had to be concerned about, but basically, if you watch out for those things, it was a great drug.
But it was around this time when COVID became this all-consuming thing that you decided that your practice was going to change gears and kind of specifically cater to people like concierge COVID medicine.
Yeah, well, I was basically doing a concierge. I was doing a low-cost concierge medicine at that point already.
Okay.
With mostly Lyme patients, fibromyalgia, people who wanted a different kind of medicine, not the standard. You know, I had my own office. I didn't take insurance. I charged $60 for a half-hour visit. And so COVID patients started hearing about me and started coming, or they wanted to get the drug ahead of time so that they'd have it if they got into trouble. And my patient population started growing with more and more people who were either having acute COVID, in which case I would treat them on the phone or on the, on video, or they would want to prepare, and they could either come into the office, but patients from all over Maine suddenly started calling me because it was very hard to get these drugs. All the other doctors, there were only about 3 or 4 doctors in the whole state who were willing to prescribe them. So
ivermectin as well, hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin.
Ivermectin, I was being investigated early in COVID by a small group of intensive care doctors. Pierre Corey did not get a hearing at a congressional hearing until late. Senator Ron Johnson held hearings, one around Thanksgiving and one before Christmas of 2020 about these drugs. And so people talked about hydroxychloroquine at the first hearing and talked primarily about ivermectin at the second hearing. And I had been a little afraid of it because I'd never prescribed ivermectin before. I felt real comfortable with hydroxychloroquine, but I realized I trusted Pierre Corey and these other people, and then shortly thereafter there were some review articles started to be published about it. So I started adding ivermectin to the drugs I used, watching it carefully, and found it was even safer than hydroxychloroquine.
Didn't it win like a Nobel Prize or something?
Yes.
It's one of the most prescribed drugs in the world, right?
So it's useful for certain parasitic diseases, although you don't have to take it for very long, 1 or 2 doses for a parasite. It turns out both of these drugs are very long-lasting in your system. So for COVID, you needed about a 5-day course of either ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine because you were building it up, and the drug stayed in your lungs for weeks or even months. Anyway, in some other tissues. So in Africa, it was being used primarily for river blindness, but also for other parasitic diseases. And 5 billion doses had been donated by Merck primarily to the WHO and to some other NGOs which had distributed it in Africa without a prescription. They're just giving it out to people. And in Latin America, but primarily in Africa. This has been going on for 40 years. There had been a doctor who had been the CEO of Merck. Merck had developed the drug. So something called avermectin had been found in soil at a Japanese golf course, made by bacteria, or maybe fungi, I can't remember which. And so this was found by a Japanese scientist, and then he shared it with Merck, and their scientists developed avermectin into ivermectin by tweaking it a little bit and making it a little better and safer. and then they market it both to humans and to animals. And farmers are used to it. They use it as a powder on chickens. They give it to horses. You know, they're accustomed to the drug. In 2015, the Japanese scientist and the Maine Merck scientist jointly won the Nobel Prize for their development of ivermectin because it had made such a difference to so many people. And as I said, it was so safe they could just give it out without a prescription to everybody. So 5 billion doses donated. We don't know how many were purchased. It's a safe drug. It should never have been suppressed by our government, but we now know our government was not trying to make people, to cure people or to prevent the disease, but they had a different agenda.
And so if they had embraced in any way hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin, that would have negated the rationale for emergency authorization for the mRNA injections.
Absolutely.
Which were first legalized by the PrEP Act that we talked about earlier.
Absolutely, that's it. They wouldn't have been able to roll out the vaccine. They would have been able to get rid of this pandemic within 2 or 3 months. They could have. These drugs are cheap to make. Hydroxychloroquine had about 20 generic manufacturers around the world. Peter Navarro went hat in hand to generic and brand manufacturers of hydroxychloroquine, got 50 or 60 million doses donated to the United States. And then, you know, crooked people in the FDA and at BARDA, primarily Janet Woodcock, who was the acting director of FDA at the time, and Rick Bright, who was the head of BARDA, together
and what is BARDA?
BARDA is an agency within HHS that was created by Congress around 2005 to dole out money, like $1.5 billion a year, more during COVID, to companies to encourage them to develop countermeasures for biological warfare, chemical warfare, or pandemics.
Okay.
And so these two agencies worked together to say, look, we're going to, Peter Navarro got the drug. Oh, we have to put it in the national stockpile. That's where it has to go. It can get, you know, an EUA, and we're going to restrict it to only hospitalized patients, which prevented, so basically, when you're infected by the COVID virus, SARS-CoV-2, you usually have the virus in your body for about 7 to 10 days, and by then your immune system has revved up enough that it fights it off. But the virus then induces your body to, or deliberately, there are many different parts of this virus. This virus was made in a lab.
Mm-hmm.
And there are
many.
I
think that's gone from racist conspiracy theory to just like fact.
Exactly.
I think everybody accepts that. I think the New York Times even recently published something that was like, finally, we know that it was produced in a lab. It's like, oh, you mean the thing that people were saying in 2020 and 2021? You're finally willing to admit that it was made in a lab. So I think that that's not a fringe theory anymore. That's consensus.
It is my belief that intentionally this virus was meant to induce blood clotting and damage to the inner layer of blood vessels in your body, that it was intentionally designed to cause immune perturbations and autoimmune effects that would cause a lot of damage in the lungs to some people, and to cause other of, I think that, you know, it was made to be highly virulent. And so
just because that's how it spreads. If it kills everyone pretty quickly, it's not going to spread as effectively as if there's a carrier or someone who's contagious.
Well, that's true.
Around.
That's true. It wasn't intended to kill you quickly. It was intended to have all these downstream effects that used your own body. And one of those downstream effects is to cause damage to mechanisms that your body uses to fight cancer cells. So cancer cells are constantly being generated in your body, but your immune system destroys them. And the immune mechanisms that are used to do that were also being damaged by the COVID virus and the COVID vaccine. I believe there's ample evidence for that.
And so just to go back a minute, you said, if we'd had a broader embrace of ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, Peter Navarro, the president's trade advisor at the time, had got these doses, safe, effective. Early on, China's saying we're using hydroxychloroquine, seeing great results. Ivermectin is safe, broadly used, effective. If we'd been making these more available, not only would we, I think, have prevented the scale of the pandemic, but you also would have prevented the scale of hysteria, because you could have had the president or media out there saying, hey, look, we've got this mild flu pandemic. I know people are scared, but we've got these time-tested, proven drugs. We've got prophylactics, and we're doing everything we can to make these available. And don't worry about it. We're not going to shut down society over a mild flu pandemic from China.
Exactly.
It could have changed. It could have changed the course of the election. It certainly would have changed the fortunes of the COVID billionaires. There'd be a lot of the stock market charts would look a little different.
Many fewer COVID billionaires, right? Less money for Zoom.
Mm-hmm.
We wouldn't have had to shut down the schools. The ramifications.
This was a history-altering decision to suppress two drugs.
Right.
That could have helped and were pretty safe.
Which suggests that actually the pandemic was deliberate, that it wasn't due to a lab leak, but to someone's use of the virus. Because if not that,
at a minimum, take advantage of the crisis.
Yes,
type
that's true.
response.
It could have been a take advantage of the crisis. But the fact that France started in October of 2019 to take hydroxychloroquine off the over-the-counter.
It's a little early.
Yeah, it was a little early. Somebody knew something.
Yeah, I think that was before you started seeing the videos on social media of, people in China walking on the street and just dropping dead.
Yes, they're right. And those were false videos.
Yes.
Because nobody was dropping dead, because that's not how this disease works. Another interesting thing that happened early was that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation put $55 million into buying stock in BioNTech in September of 2019, before BioNTech ever had a product.
That's pretty early.
Yeah, pretty
No
interesting.
product either.
No product. Never had a product.
They must have known something.
Had some idea that mRNA was a good thing.
Yeah.
September of 2019.
So I guess that kind of brings us...
Another thing that happened that I think is really critical to all this is the dissension within families and friends that all this wrought. So I had a son visit me at Christmas of 2020, the one who's not a doctor, and he's a PhD. So he's a doctor, but he's not a medical doctor.
He's like a Jill Biden doctor.
Right, and he came and visited, and I'm like, we don't have to worry about this. Here's hydroxychloroquine. I had given him some. So we don't have to lock down. We don't have to wear masks. We can visit with friends. We don't need to stand 6 feet. And he didn't say anything to me at the time, but he got incredibly angry at me. He said, later, I was putting him at risk. He was going to visit other relatives. He could have caught something from me or from friends who were coming to visit. How did I let friends into the house? And basically, we didn't talk for a year and a half. He thought I was putting people's lives at risk by that behavior. He didn't believe me that hydroxychloroquine would work. And it turned out he had a girlfriend who worked at the CDC. And so he assumed, and I understand that the CDC knew better than his mother. Of course, he didn't know that the CDC was part of this conspiracy to misrepresent everything about the pandemic, and that he should have known that his mother had been working 30 years in pandemics and biowarfare, and I did know a thing or two.
And I think it almost seems as if COVID psychosis was worse than the COVID virus itself,
and hatred,
and the government response.
The fact that they instilled that you're supposed to hate the people in your family,
tribalism, and it really empowered people to wag their finger and castigate people for insufficient obedience to the COVID scriptures of wearing masks and social distancing and having the right plexiglass arranged, in your restaurant was fine, and we can keep the liquor stores open, and the weed stores can stay open, but the gardening supply stores have to stay closed. It's a very bizarre time. But you, in the middle of it, I think at some point become outspoken.
I was always outspoken.
Well, yes, but
I
you
had
became
a blog.
outspoken with local media. Like, what really got you in trouble was conservative talk radio, I think, in my opinion.
Yeah.
When you started going on with my friends George Hale and Rick Tyler on WVOM and speaking out and criticizing locally, not just the broadly speaking our societal response to COVID, but more locally the State of Maine's response, and in particular the response from Governor Janet Mills and one of the major hospitals where her sister, Dora Mills, is a director. That's when you landed on the radar of the Bureau of Licensure and Medicine, BOLIM, which is, I guess, the panel of experts who decide who should and shouldn't practice medicine in the state of Maine. So I guess what were some of the early things that you were saying, and around what time were you saying them about the state of Maine's response to COVID-19?
Well, I was probably talking more on a federal level. By early June of 2020, I'd already published on my blog an analysis of I think 23 or 27 different ways governments and industry around the world were suppressing the use of hydroxychloroquine. And so that June of 2020, and by December of 2020, I was warning about, maybe November too, I was warning about the vaccines, that they hadn't been properly tested, that there were a lot of issues. I had a friend of mine, Dr. Sin-Hang Lee, who is a super expert on PCR tests and sequencing, who had been a professor of pathology at Yale University and who had actually trained at Wuhan in the medical school there. So he knew a lot about this, and he owns a sequencing PCR lab in Connecticut. He wrote to the FDA about problems with the clinical trials for the Pfizer vaccines and why the trials did not were not conducted properly and therefore did not give the right answer, and therefore the vaccines should not get an EUA. And I edited his response, which turned into a citizen petition to the FDA saying, please stop. You cannot go ahead with this. But of course, they wouldn't answer for a very long time, and they did go ahead. Bobby Kennedy had written a letter in early December to FDA listing what we knew about the vaccines and how dangerous they were. I had published that on my blog, so I was speaking out. And then in January, an employee of one of the schools, came to me and told me about here in Maine, I think in Machias, was telling me about lots of people getting sick after they got the COVID vaccine in January with cases of anaphylaxis, and everyone was told to be quiet about it. And there were and I was given information about how the EMTs, the emergency medical technicians who work on ambulances, were being basically forced into getting the vaccine with some illegal document that they were told to sign. And I looked into that and found
the Maine National Guard troops as well.
Yeah. Well, this was a specific document for EMTs that had been created by an NGO that taxpayers subsidize called the Immunization Action Coalition.
That's great. A government-funded, non-governmental organization.
Yeah. So I realized, I was also attending all the advisory committee meetings of FDA and CDC that were dealing with the vaccine at that time and live blogging them. So I knew a lot of what the insiders knew as a result. And I knew from the December 10 FDA advisory meeting on the vaccines that it had not been shown, that the vaccine had not been shown to prevent transmission. Because that question was asked, and the Pfizer rep, whose name was, what was it?
There were a lot of Pfizer
Janssen.
reps. I was going to say there was
Katrin
Stephen
Janssen.
Colbert. There was
Yeah.
Joe Biden was a Pfizer rep. They had many representatives out hustling their product.
Yeah, but this was the expert for the FDA advisory
Okay.
committee who was answering the questions of the doctors on the advisory committee. And she said, we didn't test it for transmission in humans. And then she realized she might be perjuring herself. So she said, after a moment, we didn't test it in humans, but in primates we did, and it didn't stop transmission. So I knew that on December 10. Anyway, I started writing about this stuff
This is
in
an
my
important
blog.
point, though, because this was one of the central claims that was used to convince the hesitant, the skeptical, young, healthy guys who are like, COVID, whatever, I'll just,
Yeah.
I don't need an experimental
That's
vaccine. I'll
right. You
shrug
have to
this off."
protect grandma.
Yeah, exactly, and that's the reason that I got one of the shots. It was the exact, the sole reason was that I didn't want to be, have on my conscience that I got grandma sick, because I was like, well, it's not going to stop me. I'm healthy, and this was also something that was key to the government and the political narrative about selling it, which was this was a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
Yes.
You didn't care about your fellow human being. You were
Exactly.
you were a psychotic, crazy person if you didn't just take this small little step to protect yourself from becoming a disease vector.
Deliberately driving a stake between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated.
And so all of it based on horseshit, really.
Doing everything the government could possibly do, including incitements. We'll pay for college students, we'll pay a semester of your tuition if you get the vaccine. $1 million lotteries to make people get the vaccine. Donuts, hamburgers.
Bill de Blasio eating French fries on video camera, still one of the most disgusting videos I've ever seen. But yeah, they did everything they possibly could to make it like a sociological weapon and a very divisive thing. But it was all based on this idea that you would stop transmission. I think if they'd come out and said, maybe 1% or less or fewer will die as a result of contracting this, but if you get this experimental shot, your symptoms will be somewhat less. I don't think
People would not have gone along.
No.
Right. Exactly. And I think they wanted to destroy the control group. They did not want a control group. Now, who came up with
and
this?
the control group, to be clear, are the people who did not get the vaccine.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. They did not want a control group to exist. The goal was to keep those people completely out of society, so they would have to be vaccinated in order to participate. And of course, some states didn't go along with this federal effort, including Florida, South Dakota.
We call them free states, Republican states.
And so they were not able, the federal government was not able. One of the most evil things they did was requiring it for college students and issuing, requirements right before the school year started in 2021. So on August 23rd of 2021, Pfizer got a license for these vaccines, even though it really didn't meet any criteria. And the two people at FDA who were most responsible for going through the paperwork and giving it a license both said we can't do it by August, and they both got fired. This was Phil Krause and Marion Gruber, and Peter Marks, who now has been basically fired by Bobby Kennedy, said, I'll take over the licensing, and he just slapped the license on the Pfizer vaccine, and then it was required for college students around the country.
And some of whom had already paid tuition for a semester,
Yes.
and then were essentially
and couldn't get
extorted.
their tuition back. They were extorted.
One of them is actually sitting over here. My producer was going through that experience as well at a college in Maine.
And they were the least affected. They had almost no symptoms.
They even
COVID.
required it for students who were attending classes remotely.
Correct. Thank you, Janet Mills.
That was a Janet Mills special.
Yes.
So policies is, I guess, particular to the state of Maine, a healthcare worker vaccine mandate that came down in August of 2021 was delayed and then
they
enforced.
couldn't mandate it until they gave it a license.
Yeah.
So they illegally licensed it, and then immediately the mandates for the military, for healthcare workers, for college students, started being issued within days.
And it was originally supposed to take effect October 1st of 2021. They saw the writing on the wall, knew that there would be mass non-compliance and some perverse unintended consequences of the mandate. They delayed it a month and still ended up with a healthcare workforce shortage. Thousands of people left the healthcare industry at a moment when you would think we'd want as many healthcare workers as possible. So we created a healthcare crisis in the middle of a healthcare crisis through bad healthcare policies for a product that would create yet more healthcare problems and crises. So you had a few criticisms of the Mills administration's policies here in the state.
Yes. In one Canadian province, I think it was Ontario, it might have been Quebec, there were so many nurses who were leaving that they had to pull back and not require vaccination because they would have lost too many nurses for the system to handle it.
Whereas we just raised the healthcare costs across the board by paying triple or quadruple for
yes,
travel nurses
exactly.
to come in and fill
jobs. We paid a fortune, and then later they didn't even require
them.
the vaccine of the travel nurses.
How absurd is that? How absurd is that for
it was all a
state,
game.
Yeah, one big game. So now I guess we kind of get to your case where you've have a long history of expertise with vaccines, with the human body, medical field, scientific literature. You've been following this disease outbreak and the response as closely as anyone, and you start to criticize the federal and state response to this, and then all of a sudden the Bureau of Licensure and Medicine comes knocking, and
Yes.
you are investigated for spreading misinformation.
Yes. So, as I said, the vaccine got licensed the Pfizer vaccine, August 23rd, and around that time, September maybe, I attended a pharmacy board meeting to try to convince them to stop pressuring pharmacies to withhold ivermectin. Let people use this drug. It's a great drug. And so a report went from the pharmacy board to the medical board about Dr. Nass. I was doing my legal citizen thing. We're allowed to talk, the public is invited.
Oath, right?
The Hippocratic Oath, it was my responsibility to say, this is a really good drug. It's safe. Please don't suppress it. They're the ones who are suppressing it, along with the Bolam. And probably through Janet Mills' offices. And so I got reported for that. And then suddenly in October, two strangers who have never met me or any of my patients reported me to the Bolam for things I said online. And so Bolam said...
One of them, by the way, I looked up, is like an unemployed truck driver or a progressive activist. He's like an Antifa wacko who heard what you said online and reported you.
Friends of mine told me they actually knew the guy. He used to hang around Portland when they were doing the anti-Wall Street rallies.
Yeah.
And he would take pictures of people.
Yeah.
So they thought he was an agent. He has a daughter who's a doctor at Maine Medical Center. So it's unclear if he's just an unemployed truck driver.
Yeah, well, he's a weirdo.
But anyway, from South Portland. And then the other person was supposed to be a master's level therapist from Ellsworth who claimed that I was saying something on Twitter that she didn't like. And when the Bolam asked her, because we were able to FOIA for the documents, Bolam asked her what it was. She told them to Google me. And then they called her and said, look, because they were trying to get more evidence. Do you know they really needed evidence that I had done something wrong medically. What I do online is outside their purview.
But they were still at this point investigating you for the crime of spreading misinformation,
of speech,
which I think is kind of key to the story at this point of the persecution of Dr. Meryl Nass begins with an investigation into saying things that
into
the
First Amendment issues.
The government didn't like what you were saying.
Exactly. So they went back to her. Do you know any patients? Is there anyone else we can contact? She told them to Google me. Finally, she said she would get somebody to help her, use the internet so she could find something that I had said that she didn't like. So one wonders, if she doesn't know how to use Twitter, how is it that she's complaining to Bolam about what I said on Twitter? You know, so I'm guessing that both of them were agents of some kind. In any event, they start investigating me and ask me to justify what I said. And I wrote to them and I said, you know, show me where you have jurisdiction over what I do outside my medical practice. That really bothered them. They don't like, because I had worked on the anthrax vaccine issue and got into a lot of medical legal, you know, I was involved in cases with anthrax vaccine. I had studied FDA law. I sort of knew what they could and couldn't do. So then they started realizing they couldn't just heavy me, that they had to come up with something more substantial. They didn't want a First Amendment case, which I would win. Mm-hmm. So they desperately started looking for evidence that I had done something wrong with a patient. And no one had ever complained. So I'd once had a Bolam complaint from the son of a patient about something I had done, which it turned out he was completely wrong. And he wrote me an apology, and Bolam dropped that. And I'd never had another complaint. And when I worked in Massachusetts, no complaints. I've never had a malpractice case. You know, I have one of the cleanest records ever. I'm probably the only doctor in Maine who's given 6 congressional testimonies. I've written about 30 papers. You know, I've talked at conferences around the world.
And during COVID, none of your patients complained.
No patient complained.
You're being investigated by the Bureau of Licensure in Medicine for spreading misinformation because 2 non-experts didn't like what you were saying on the radio.
Right.
None of your patients have complained.
Exactly.
But you've still got this investigation digging around, looking for some kind of violation, any violation. Very much a show me the person and I'll show you the crime.
Exactly. Finally, the Bolam was able to get, fairly quickly, within a couple of months, a complaint from a nurse midwife in Ellsworth, whose grandfather was Wilhelm Reich, oddly, that I had treated. We had a mutual patient who was pregnant. I had given her hydroxychloroquine, which is approved in pregnancy. The nurse midwife had given her monoclonal antibodies, which are not approved in pregnancy, which were EUA. And the nurse midwife complained to Bolam about me, whereas I had done what was legal, you know, and she hadn't. And
she did what was politically favorable.
Yes. Yeah. And she didn't know any better. The other one was a doctor at Penn Bay who had one of my patients had to be admitted to the hospital with COVID. And the patient wasn't complaining, but the patient told her that I'd given her ivermectin. And so this doctor wrote to Bolam and said, Dr. Nass gave this patient horse paste. That doctor didn't even know it was an approved drug for humans. So she reported me for that. Bolam never investigated with either of those 2 patients. Oh, and then I self-reported. I wrote a letter to Bolam during this time, in November of 2021. And I said, when they asked me to respond to justify what I was saying on the internet, I said, what? Tell me what I said that was a problem. And they wouldn't. You know, at that point, they wouldn't. Later, they just gave like 30 things you said. They didn't say what was wrong with what I said, but justify it. So I had given a testimony to the New Hampshire legislature a week earlier about ivermectin and managing COVID. And so I sent them my testimony. I said, tell me where the misinformation is here. And they wouldn't respond. But that, I'm sure, pissed him off. And it was made public. So the Defender, CHD's online newspaper, published it. And that made them look foolish. Eventually, they decided to expand the complaints. So they made 3 different lists of complaints against me. They kept the first list was mainly speech, misinformation, and then they realized we're not going to get away with that. So then they created, after they had gotten the records of these patients, and this one patient that I had self-reported, I said, look, I told them, I said, look, I had to lie to a pharmacist that this patient had Lyme disease in order for the pharmacist to dispense the ivermectin. He's a diabetic. He has all these comorbidities. I was afraid he was going to die. And in order to get him a potentially life-saving drug, I was forced to lie to a pharmacist. Don't make doctors do this. Mm-hmm. Allow us to have this drug. And so they took that and they said, you lied to a pharmacist. So
Yeah.
that's a felony or something, you know. And I mean, it's a victimless crime, right? Turned out the patient did buy the ivermectin. He got it from the pharmacist and never took it because he was scared because of all this other stuff. Well, anyway, so they went after me for lying to the pharmacist, which I had self-reported.
At this point, they've dropped the misinformation thing, right? So
They dropped half. They dropped most of it.
Yeah.
And they started focusing on little piddly things like I didn't get informed consent from my patients to treat them with telemedicine.
Which was broadly authorized in the
By
state of Maine, right?
Right, which had
They said
it was
everything's moving to
authorized.
Zoom. Everything's moving to Zoom. So
Yes.
telemedicine, like they basically wrote a blank check to do telemedicine. Across the
Exactly.
board.
But then they said I hadn't gotten informed. Well, no, they got that wrong because the informed consent was for the patient to say, I'm willing to do telemedicine instead of an in-person visit. But I was offering in-person visits. So you could come see me or you could do telemedicine. I'm open to either. Therefore, I didn't need an informed consent. I wasn't only restricting them to telemedicine. So, but they said, well, you didn't give them get an informed consent. So that was crime. There was one other thing, I can't remember what it was.
There was a
Oh,
HIPAA
yes.
violation because you
Yes, a
talked,
HIPAA violation.
to the son of a father who
Right,
was
because I talked
suffering.
to relatives about these patients. The son, the father, the mother were living together in the same house. The son was taking care of the parents. All three of them got COVID. And I was talking to him about how to manage his parents. Oh, that's a HIPAA violation. Bullshit.
So you were a doctor counseling a son who I'm guessing was terrified that his parents had contracted this virus, and the Bureau of Licensure in Medicine used that as one of the counts in, I
Yes.
guess, the death sentence
Yes.
for your medical license.
Yes. And then in another case.
Seems like great.
I mean,
I'm glad the state of Maine is doing that. That's fantastic.
And then with the pregnant patient who got immediately better after I treated her, but she was not thinking clearly. You know, you don't think clearly when you have COVID, at least at that time. She put her husband on the phone, and so I was telling him how to care for her. And they didn't like that either.
Okay.
It's like I didn't get an informed consent to talk to the husband. They're in the room. The wife hands him the phone, you know, and says, please explain to my husband what I need. So that's basic. So I was found guilty of these crimes.
These heinous offenses. These
terrible
these
offenses.
Terrible crimes.
And 39 and a half months ago, they suspended my license. They did not revoke it because then I would have had some access to the courts that I didn't otherwise have. I appealed. I was supposed to have heard about the appeal in April, but I haven't. And we opened a lawsuit against the board for an improper prosecution, and that judge is waiting for the appeal to be settled before he finishes the case against the Bolum, and that's where I am.
And I watched the original hearing, and I have to say, they didn't just, they seemed gleeful at the fact that they were having an opportunity to come after you.
Yes.
And the other thing is, with the benefit of hindsight, we can look at all these documents that you guys got through Discovery and through the Freedom of Access Act. And one that, of course, jumps out to me is an email that Dora Mills, who is the director of something or other, the director of innovation, the director of political connections, the director of being the governor's sister, I don't know, at Maine Health, the Dora Mills wrote an email to the head of the Bureau of Licensure and Medicine with, or one of the...
She wrote one of the members of the board.
One of the members of the board. And the email was essentially forwarding along a list of the misinformation that you'd spread, apparently, that was trading hands amongst politically connected individuals.
On WVOM.
Yes. So things, bullet points of things you'd said on the radio, which, I mean, if you look back, all of them were true and accurate. None of them, it wasn't misinformation. You were, I guess, prescient.
Right. No one's ever shown that anything I said was wrong.
Exactly. So that's the heinous thing. This whole thing starts because of an investigation into you for saying things that were true, but politically inconvenient for the governor and for Maine Health, which has seen its fortunes grow greatly as a result from the beginning of the pandemic to now. But Dora sends this email to a member of the Bureau or the Board of Licensure in Medicine, essentially saying, "You might want to take a look at this. You know, we got this Dr. Nass out there causing some problems." That seems to me extreme.
And this was right at the end of being having my license suspended. So it was right when the board was meeting to suspend my license. Might have been the day after, or a couple of days after. But clearly, it's a bad look for the sister of the governor to be trying to influence the board to rule against me. And so after that, so my license was initially suspended without a hearing on January 11th of 2022, which they're not allowed to do, actually. That was illegal because there's a statute that lists all the things you can suspend a doctor's license for without a hearing. Normally you need a hearing. So they either needed to make me seem crazy or a substance abuser, and I wasn't either. And so they demanded that in early February I go see their psychologist for an investigation, bring $2,000 with you to pay for the visit, and then he would presumably give them the diagnosis that they needed that would justify the suspension. I happened to get COVID then, so I had to cancel the visit, and then my lawyer said, "Don't go. You don't go. They have no grounds. There was no, what's the word? Due process.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. There was no reason. No one's ever said you were a substance abuser, crazy, demented, or anything else, that you have to go for a mental health evaluation with their psychologist. So do not go." And so we filed a lawsuit against them over that. And because they had no evidence, they didn't dispute. So they never forced me to have that psychological exam. But what that meant was they never had a justification for the license suspension initially. Then they went through the whole hearings. And of course, what Dora had said then was left in their minds that, look, we're doing the governor's job for her.
And it should be remarked upon, too, that I think the chair of the Bureau of Licensure in Medicine at the time was an ophthalmologist.
Who kept falling asleep throughout the hearing.
I mean, I wonder how deep is her research into vaccines and vaccine history, and if how closely had she been following the literature.
That was the other thing.
She didn't respond to comment when I was initially writing about your case and your story. I guess now two years ago.
I have to tell you something. The BOLM members were fed a bill of goods about me. So when they had their discussion about me at the time of the license suspension, they're talking with each other, and we got a transcript. And they're saying, "Has she ever published a paper? Who is this woman?" They were told I was a country bumpkin. They had no idea I'd testified to Congress, that I'd written papers, that I was actually an expert in vaccines.
Not that there's anything
They
wrong
didn't
with country
know
bumpkins,
that.
but yes.
Yeah, none of them were expert in any of this.
Well, these individuals certainly weren't experts, it seems, in Dr. Nass or who should and shouldn't have their medical licenses here. I mean, that's the scariest thing of all, is that they seem to have just gone along with a political inquisition.
Well, they're appointed by the governor.
Yeah. But it's not like this is $1 million job that they're appointed to.
No,
I suppose
they get
maybe
paid
it's
very little.
I
It's
suppose
prestige.
it's prestigious, or it used to be at one point in time. But the fact
Maybe
that
it's a stepping stone to something bigger.
perhaps, yeah. But that they would go along with it, it's scary. And and it was part of a culture of retribution that I think is much more broad in this state than just COVID-related matters. I've also talked with Rick Savage, who in a little bit of a different position, but it seemed like people who spoke out against the prevailing, political, religious orthodoxy got stepped on. I mean,
Yes.
the full weight of government power really came down on you.
Yes.
Your license to practice medicine, the key to your livelihood, stripped. You still don't have your license to practice
No.
medicine. So you've now, I mean, you're enduring for almost 3 years now.
Over 3 years.
The punitive arm of the government for the crime of saying things on the radio that were true.
And trying to save people's lives
Yes.
from a pandemic that was being grossly mismanaged, and I was trying to turn that around as well. You know, I was trying to tell people this is what needs to be done, and anyway, you know, as a result of all that, I started working with Mr. Kennedy back in 2001, in early 2001, and wound up helping to edit 3 of his books and work with him on other projects, and have continued to work with him on and off since in an informal way. I guess we formalized the arrangement. I signed a non-disclosure agreement and a consulting, but then I decided not to charge Children's Health Defense for that at the time. So I've been an unpaid consultant, and I guess all I can say is I know a lot about pandemics, and I know a lot about biological warfare, and I have nothing else to lose. I'm very committed to telling the truth about all of this moving forward, and
yeah, it doesn't seem like you've made a lot of money off of your COVID experience.
No, I've lost a lot.
You said you were charging $60 for a consult with patients to give them access to what ended up being a cheap, life-saving medicine.
Right.
You were going out of your way, taking great personal risk to speak out and share your expertise, whereas some of the people, like I would say Dora Mills and some other hospital employees, Nirav Shah, for example, have profited greatly from towing the line and parroting what they were told to say about vaccines, about lockdowns, about all different areas of the COVID-19 response. So I think that it does add some legitimacy and some authenticity to what you're saying. But I can't help but note I guess the tragic irony of you as a young medical student, I guess before this, but as a young MIT student, deciding not to pursue a career in physics because of the militaristic aspects of it, and now ending with a career in bioweapons.
Right, trying to stop the use of bioweapons. It's my whole life I've chosen to focus on areas that other people won't go into, because they need some light shined on them, and by chance they became big areas like anthrax before anyone had heard of anthrax, Ebola, Zika, and COVID. So. And even now, because all these other people are focusing on the COVID vaccines, I've sort of left them alone and moved into globalism and how the globalists are trying to gain control through outside of democratic processes, gain control of public health, of the food system, and things like that.
Because they've lost control of the democratic system that they used to have some control of, thanks to President Trump, to and to, I think in no small part, to Bobby Kennedy. The union of those two, the MAHA and MAGA, the Make America Healthy Again and Make America Great Again alliance, I think was pretty critical to the victory in November, making it too big to rig, as they say. So having lost control of the democratic mechanisms in the United States, well, they would have to seek the extra democratic or, I guess, globalist. It's one of those words that's been used so much, and
yes.
It's a difficult term because there's so many different interpretations of it. But I guess non-sovereign entities, you might say.
Yeah, I would say people who are seeking to centralize control and gain power. Gain authority that is now managed by national governments, and to centralize that into other institutions such as the UN, the WHO, World Trade Organization, World Bank, etc. Mm-hmm. So that's how I'm using the term. You're right, it's a very difficult term. There was something I wanted to say, but I've forgotten. Go ahead.
So you started studying the Global Pandemic Treaty. You read the fine print. You discovered this kind of scheme where they're trying to incentivize all of these various countries to provide pathogens and samples to a centralized, extra governmental entity, an unelected governmental entity, and you start briefing members of Congress. And I guess what is the what is the status of that? I'm going to guess that it hit a brick wall with the election of President Trump.
So we got 49 Republican, all the Republican senators to come out against it. We got 22 attorneys general, and they said, look, we're not going to do this. We're not going to allow this in our states. And 26 governors, all Republican, to say we're not letting this in our states. And then we also got 2 state legislatures to pass laws saying that any directives coming from the WHO, whether directly or indirectly, in other words, whether through the federal government or not, will not have any force of law in our states. So that was Oklahoma and what was the other one? Louisiana. Wonderful job, because now it's not just the Attorney General who's going to turn over in a couple of years, but it's actual law forever in those states until they overturn it. And they not only that, they said we're not allowing any authority of the World Health Organization, the United Nations, or the World Economic Forum in our states. So that's what Oklahoma and Louisiana did. Trump has said he would do what he tried to do in his first term, which is leave the WHO, which is expected to occur in January. He's directed the federal agencies to stop negotiating the pandemic treaty, stop attending those meetings. And what we need to do now, since a very watered-down version of the international health regulations did get passed at the WHO last May, we have until July to officially reject those amendments. And a very, very watered-down version of the pandemic treaty is set to be voted on by the WHO later this month, at the end of May. And knowing how the WHO operates, even though it requires a 2/3 vote, I don't think they would dare to have a vote. They're going to create a situation where they claim they have consensus and they don't hold a vote. And they will have strong-armed everybody that might disagree beforehand. Just don't break you might not agree with this, but don't break the consensus. That's what I'm predicting will happen. So I think a version of the pandemic treaty, which is not that dangerous, will go through. But what they did is to say, all the provisions that were so controversial, like the lab, like creating this pandemic library, that's all going to be negotiated in the future. And we're going to create a conference of parties which will negotiate all the provisions of the pandemic treaty in the future.
So this is like Obamacare. You got to pass it before you can find out what's in it.
Precisely.
It's the camel's nose under the tent. Yeah,
so that's what's happened. And it's very likely, it may not happen, but it's very likely that the WHO will manage to get this passed. And then every nation that signs it, because you will have to ratify and sign it, will be subject to whatever provisions are decided in the future. Very crazy. And they've made it impossible to get out. Once you're in, this is maybe the thing that will stop nations from signing up. Once you're in, you can't even ask to get out for 2 years, and it's going to take a year for you to get out. So you can get in 1 month, but it's going to take you 36 months to get out.
Like the Hotel California. So I guess just understanding that, it would probably seem like some of these conservative or Republican right-leaning states, open-minded states like Louisiana or Oklahoma, should probably move ahead with passing similar legislation to block these globalist organizations from having influence in their states, even if now there's this kind of temporary reprieve. Seems like there are, conservatives doesn't seem to be the right word, because it's more like radicals are the ones who have the ideas that are, anti-COVIDian these days, or would support the Make America Healthy Again movement, or support President Trump or Bobby Kennedy. Those are the radicals, not the conservatives. But it would seem like there's this kind of sigh of relief after the election, and this loss of a sense of urgency, and people are like, oh, we won the election, we can relax.
Yes.
But Maybe that's not the case. Maybe that's a false sense of security, and other states should still be moving ahead with similar legislation to what Louisiana and Oklahoma passed, just in case.
I think you're absolutely right, although it's a little bit of a harder sell now that we've got those treaties watered down. And Trump is leaving the WHO. So that sort of protects us for the time being. What's important is to all these other countries. So Europe, is banning free speech. The European Union is controlling the elections in Romania. They're, trying to neutralize Hungary, and they're putting people in jail for tweets in England.
Yeah.
So, until the public at large in the world realizes that there still is a very concentrated attempt to bring tyranny down on all of us, and it's just happening, much more aggressively in Europe, and they're holding back in the U.S. for the moment, trying to destroy Trump in many other ways, not allowing the public to see the great things that he's done. I mean, Trump just signed an executive order yesterday to end federal funding of gain-of-function research in the U.S. and overseas. I mean, this is fabulous. This is huge. He's trying to prevent biological warfare while the WHO is promoting it. But he's not going to get favorable reviews from the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times.
And for those who don't remember, I guess, recent history, it was President Barack Obama who originally did the temporary ban on gain-of-function research, which Anthony Fauci then circumvented and used the EcoHealth Alliance funding to take it to the Wuhan Institute of Virology and continue gain-of-function research.
Yes.
So Trump issuing this executive order and not getting celebrated for it. I mean, this was something that Barack Obama did to little acclaim at the time.
Right, and Barack Obama didn't enforce it, whereas Trump is attempting to enforce it. The other thing Barack Obama didn't do, he fooled people. He made people think that he was imposing a moratorium, but it was only for SARS-like viruses and influenza viruses, including bird flu. And no other viruses were included in that moratorium.
Oh, so he kept the the weapons program for the most part online. One thing I do want to ask is, you've probably been following 23andMe, the DNA company. And I think you probably immediately know where this question is going, but DNA company, everyone thought, I want to figure out what my ancestry is, swipe their cheeks, send their DNA to this company. This company builds this massive database of people's genetic profile. They promise they're not going to share it or give it to life insurance companies or anything. And then all of a sudden they're bankrupt, and that huge body of information is up for grabs. How useful could that genetic data be if you're somebody at the Defense Department or the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and you're looking to develop a virus that targets a specific population, a virus that's, say, racially selective, a virus that, can take out your enemy while leaving your own people relatively undisturbed and immune?
This is a very sensitive issue. Bobby Kennedy got rolled over the coals for saying that COVID virus or vaccine may have genetically favored certain races, like Jews or Chinese. But in fact, it's true that, for example, let me give you a good example. The pandemics vaccine for 2009's swine flu that was used in Europe, many millions of doses, caused narcolepsy in adolescents. We know of over 1,300 cases. And you needed a genetic susceptibility, and 25% of white people, Caucasians, had a genetic susceptibility. And it was only those people whom that vaccine caused narcolepsy in. If you didn't have the genetic susceptibility, you didn't get narcolepsy, even if you were vaccinated. South Africa had a very active program looking for a racially specific weapon prior to 1993, when South Africa decided, de Klerk, who was the prime minister or president, decided to give the blacks majority rule in South Africa to avoid a bloodbath, a war, which everyone was expecting. And so so remember, this is 32 years ago. Prior to that time, there was an active research program in genetic weapons. The U.S. Army has been collecting DNA from all service members for a minimum of 25 years that I know of. And they have a serum bank underground in Washington, D.C., which has collected serum from soldiers for, at least 25 years, which can allow you to go back, if you have access, and see whether you have a certain gene or whether you had a certain preponderance to a disease that happens later. So, yes, there has been research, I'm sure, on genetic-specific weapons. It's because this is so controversial, so dirty, no one will admit doing it, except it was found that the South Africans were doing it. But absolutely. And the other thing is that there are genetic predispositions for whether you're going to respond to a drug or not and what dose would be the optimal dose. Because I may have an enzyme that breaks down a drug 100 times faster than you. So I may only need 100th of the dose of that drug to work for me. And these are things that pharmaceutical companies know. And that's why 23andMe is selling their data, supposedly without anyone's name or identifying information, to pharmaceutical companies. And they thought they could make a killing, but they didn't. And now they've gone under. And the CEO, who was the sister-in-law of Sergey Brin, who was the founder of Google, and she had worked for Google, she died last year, or maybe the year before, of pancreatic cancer in her 50s. Most likely a turbo cancer because of her vaccination. So there's nothing good that you should not send your cheek swab or your blood to any of these organizations to have them identify your genes, because someday in the future it may be harmful to you, but we can't say exactly how that will be at this point in time.
And I mean, maybe, just guessing, we've reached a critical mass already where they have enough samples where they can accomplish their objective.
Well, there's two objectives.
Maybe 23andMe is still going to make a killing.
Yes.
Just not financially.
Yeah. So one objective is to figure out by race, religion, or other demographic concerns whether you have a predisposition to being harmed by a vaccine or a disease or a drug. But the other is you, yourself. They have your name. They have your genetic material. What are you particularly susceptible to? And just the way they're directing ads on the internet to you specifically, based on your psychological profile and all the other things you've looked at on the internet during your life, they could direct harmful vaccines or drugs to you too, based on that in the future, or maybe now. These are such scary things to think about.
They are. It's like a dystopian sci-fi movie. The idea of biological weapons. I mean, but really they're
targeted to individuals.
Yeah, they've been. I mean, this is something that I think has been talked about in science fiction for quite a while. I think the guy who wrote Starship Troopers wrote a book that was specifically about biological weapons targeted at whole races, in fact. And you can just have a very basic imagination and understand the implications of what that would mean in a global biological warfare scenario. So I guess absent the shooting down the pandemic treaty, like how do you prevent these kind of dystopian scenarios from becoming real? Or is it just this point where we've reached where, because we know that China or Russia or North Korea are going to develop these things, the United States and Australia and Israel and the United Kingdom have to develop them as well, and it's like a mad science biological version of mutually assured destruction.
Yeah.
You
So
know,
that is what we have now. President Nixon started the solution but didn't finish it in 1969 and 70 when he declared that the United States would unilaterally withdraw from biological warfare. We would destroy our offensive weapons. We had huge stockpiles of biological and chemical weapons that supposedly have all been destroyed now. And that we would initiate a treaty, which we did. The treaty was written in 1972. The Biological Weapons Convention came into force in 1975. Nations were in such a hurry to get that done that they said they couldn't negotiate provisions for inspections, challenge inspections, or sanctions, punishments. So they said, we'll negotiate that later, but let's get this done now. And so there are 183 countries that have signed on to the Biological Weapons Convention that are parties. Israel never signed. But the United States interrupted the negotiations around 2000. We basically took the table with the playing cards and turned it upside down and said, we're walking away from this. When nations thought they were just about at the end of the negotiations, to strengthen this treaty and make it meaningful. So for 25 years, there has been very little movement on that, but now is the time where there could be movement. It would be a lot easier. So that was a real pandemic treaty. I mean, it was intended to stop biological warfare, unlike this recent WHO pandemic treaty, which was really designed to make it more likely and put the WHO in control of it. So now Rand Paul initiated a bill at the end of last year to try and have a board that would control biological weapons in the U.S. It was somewhat complicated. It relied on reporting. And now Rand Paul is on the outs, I would assume, with Trump because he attempted to start a revolt over the tariffs. And he lost a vote by one vote, by J.D. Vance's vote, just recently. So I don't. The executive order to stop gain-of-function research was directing agencies to come up with plans for how to do it in 90 days, 120 days, and 180 days. I think it's an excellent executive order because the language has to be perfect. The scientists are going to yell and scream about what they want to do, what they want to be allowed to do, and it requires some very careful looking at what they will be allowed to do and what they won't be allowed to do. And some scientists like Fauci have expanded the meaning of the term gain of function so that it encompasses research that probably should be allowed to continue, just to muddy the waters. Mm-hmm. And so it's going to take months to get this exactly right, but as soon as they've gotten it right, or even before, all the other nations need to be pulled in, and I include Israel in that, because nations will not go along unless everybody goes along. And the only way to prevent biological warfare and genetic warfare medical warfare, is to have inspections, challenges, punishments, and have everybody part of a meaningful treaty. I think the quickest way to do it is through the Biological Weapons Convention. Another one could be developed and negotiated, but after 3.5 years of messing around with the pandemic treaty, I just think it makes a lot more sense to use the Biological Weapons Convention. It has some loopholes. It needs to be tightened, but everybody knows what the loopholes are. There's just a few of them. You're not trying to negotiate 50 different things, and let's get this done.
Well, I thank you very much for coming in and talking with us. I'm sure we could talk for several more hours, and maybe we'll have you back to talk about Make America Healthy Again and what Bobby Kennedy is doing at the Department of Health and Human Services, because there's 15 different subjects we could explore there. But I guess the last question that I'll end with is, should Anthony Fauci be in jail?
Well, he needs to go through a legal process first. He needs his hand on the Bible in a witness stand.
Yeah.
And then I think most people would agree that he is guilty of crimes against humanity in various ways. We don't have good laws about scientific misconduct. So the only thing you can do if someone is guilty of scientific misconduct, which he certainly is to stop giving them federal grants. But I think that he has perjured himself. He's misrepresented things in such a way that we've had many hundreds of thousands of deaths in the United States. And I guess we have to find the right crimes that to charge him with. But I think he misrepresented the moratorium. He allowed Ralph Barrick to continue with gain-of-function experiments without ever going through the process that was set up in 2014 during the Obama administration, that if you're doing gain-of-function, you were supposed to go through a committee at NIH to see whether it was dangerous or not. But somehow Ralph Barrick believed he'd been given a waiver, and he published that he'd been given a waiver. I've read the article where he says so. So somehow Fauci was responsible for that. So he created a process and then never used the process. It was a joke. Fauci created this CREID, something like $80 million program right at the beginning of the pandemic when Christian Anderson and the other authors of The Proximal Origin, when he inveigled them to lie and misrepresent the origins of COVID, and then gave at least two of them very large creed grants that he probably created for that purpose. And if we go back and look at other grants that NIAID has given out, we'll probably see that he used those as well. He was a capo. They say he even had a photograph of Marlon Brando as the Godfather in his office.
Next to all the photos of himself, by the way.
And he ran the NIAID as if it was a family, and omerta. He managed to control all the virologists around the world and stop them from telling the truth about COVID because he was funding all of them. So it's quite a story. Hopefully it will come out.
Yeah. Well, and I think stuff like this helps it come out, and a free and open internet and X and Substack and other platforms where you're resistant to being censored. And I guess the last thing, where can people find you? Because I know you're on Substack, you have a website, you're on X. Where can people find you on
I was
social
censored
media?
on X twice, so I was thrown off X
Was
during...
this during the Elon era or after?
Yes, I've actually been... My main X site suddenly froze last December during the Elon.
I think it's because you needed an avatar. I think you had the egg, just the egg, the picture, the profile picture you're supposed to upload.
I don't know. That's not what they're telling me.
Oh, okay.
And I had a blue check too.
Oh, okay.
In any event, so I had a secondary account that I never used that now I use, but it has almost no followers. So I've been censored on X. I was very much censored on YouTube. And what I have is a Substack, merylnass.substack.com. It's called Meryl's Chaos Newsletter.
Okay.
And that's where I try to put out most of my information.
All right. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for coming in and talking with us today.
Thank you.